session is going to be Dr. Harini Nagendra, Director of Research Center at the Azim Premji University. She leads the University Center for Climate Change and Sustainability. Over the past 25 years, Dr. Harini Nagendra has been at the leading edge of research examining conservation in forests and cities of South Asia from the perspective of both landscape ecology and social justice. So, Yashaswini here has a question for the speaker.
Harini Akka, you have been at the cutting edge of research on forest conservation and cities in South Asia. We are very worried about the future, Akka. Are you too? Please share with us.
I am very worried, but I'm also always an optimist, and I think we need to be optimistic or hopeful about our future, because it's always in our hands, if not to fix it completely, to make it better and to make ourselves move towards a stronger world. So I feel when we all come together, we can achieve magic, and so I'm always hopeful.
Thank you so much, Akka. Thank you so much for the answer. You can go ahead with your session.
Okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I want to thank everyone for putting this together. And I can see Siddharth's comments. So I'm clearly standing between you and lunch, and I will not take too much of your time. Trying to see. Let me just share screen. Give me a second. Yeah. Okay. Can you see the full screen?
Yes, Akka, we can see your screen.
Okay, okay. So I'm advancing slides. If you can't see them at any point, let me know. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I moved to a different slide, and this is what we call a nightlight satellite image. Why we work? I'm going to talk to you about cities and biodiversity, and why cities, because we're talking about there is no other planet. But yes, why do we care about cities? Because if you look at this satellite image, it shows you how cities are lit up at night, and what it really tells you is that, who lights the city at night? Only mad people like us who live in cities. I mean, you look at any village around, people are living far more sustainably, right? At night, when everyone's gone to sleep, they don't waste current or electricity on lighting up places. So it's only people in cities who light up the place at night. And so if you take a satellite picture and look at the world at night, you can actually see where the cities are. And you see India, full of cities. See China, full of cities. So the world is experiencing a huge shift to cities, or an urban shift, as we call it. World estimates say that by 2050, 75% of the world will live in cities. And so cities are really critical when you're talking about climate change or future survival of humanity, right? Now, this is a graph which shows you the cities across the world, and the red and the yellow cities are the fastest growing cities in the world. Which are the fastest growing cities? India, China, Nigeria. When you say city, normally what comes to people's minds are the old cities like New York or Paris or those kinds of cities. But what we find is the cities are actually in different parts of the world now. India, Nigeria, China, these are the fastest growing urban areas. Even in India, if you think of cities, we'll think of Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi, the large big cities. But the fastest growing cities are small cities, Faridabad, Surat, those kinds of small places that are growing very rapidly. So how are we going to deal with this kind of huge growth? And if you think back of whichever city you are all from, I know many of you are Parikrama students, you are from Bangalore, but if you think of whichever city, if you think of your city, normally what describes your city, you'll think of dust, you'll think of traffic, you might think of loud horns, you might think of going to and fro in the bus, or being stuck on the road, or you might think of tall buildings or a mall. Very rarely do we think of nature in our cities. And yet, we know that unless we have ecosystems or ecology in our cities, we're going to have all kinds of problems. We know our cities, have these problems. The water pollution you can see on the top left, that foaming water, many of you will know that is Belandur Lake. This lake, because people wash their clothes and put in lots of detergents, because people's sewage goes into the water, and there are a lot of fats, and those fats also create bubbles. For a number of different reasons, you have this frothy foaming water, and this is dirty foam, this is toxic foam, and it comes out of these lakes and water bodies onto our faces. It does this in the Yamuna also every year. right? So you have water pollution. That polluted water enters the ground. When all of us get tanker water, we get water that is polluted with all of these things that have entered, from this foamy water, it penetrates into the ground and it enters us, our bodies. There are heat islands. There are actually estimates. So if you think of climate change, cities will warm by 1.5 and 2 degrees. But the concrete in the city is also going to take additional heat during the day, and it's not going to release it at night. In the night, concrete holds on to the heat. It doesn't release it. And the next day, the already hot concrete gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And so it is by the end of the summer, you might find that cities get actually as hot as 7 to 10 degrees hotter. Not just 1.5 to 2 degrees hotter, but 7 to 10 degrees hotter. The combination of being a city and climate change. Whereas there's even one area in Rajasthan, which in 2017 became so hot that the tar on the road melted. Imagine going around in Bangalore or Delhi or whichever city you're from, if the tar has melted. The whole city will be in confusion and lockdowns, worse than the kind of lockdowns we had, because at least in emergencies you could move around. But if the tar is melting, how are you going to move in a city? Right? So there's heat island effects. There's flooding. And it's very ironic. Cities like Mumbai, Chennai, which you're on the coast, you get a lot of rain. Kerala, it gets floods every monsoon, and then the cities become dry in the summer. Why is this? Because there are no wetlands, no lakes, no places to hold the water and put the water into the ground. Instead, there's concrete everywhere, and the concrete takes the water straight away and out of the city. There's no place for it to percolate into the ground. So the same places that have too much water and a problem of flooding in the monsoon will have too little water and a problem of drought in the summer. And then, of course, you have air pollution. I think a latest estimate I was seeing said that 70% of the people in India live in a place which has polluted air. 70% of us live in a place which has polluted air. That's huge. So cities have a lot of problems. But I'd like to start with this question that one of you asked me just now. How do you have hope? So I want to tell you a story about how and why we have hope. Right? So if we don't have ecology in our cities, we cannot live well. You can't eat money, you can't breathe money, you can't, it's nice to live in a city, it's nice to be having some of the opportunities that you have in cities. But if you don't have clean air, clean water, fresh food, and a nice park to walk in, a large ground to play with your friends, some trees to climb, some fruits that you can eat directly from the trees, the sound of bird song, all of us need this. Unless we can get it, we are not going to have what we call well-being. We won't be happy people. Right? So I'll start with the story of Bangalore, which is a city that I studied a lot, and this is a book that I've written on the city based on about 15 years of work in Bangalore. And why am I calling it nature in the city? Because I'm talking about why we need these kinds of ecosystems, these trees with these flowers that you see, or the other kinds of lakes and trees and other kinds of places that you see. Why do we need nature in the city? So let's talk about Bangalore. Bangalore started from that tiny little red dot that you see in the heart of the city to this huge gray area that you see. It was founded in 1537. This is Bangalore again, but this is overlaid on a map that we call a topographic map. Okay. What do I mean by a topographic map? It means it shows us the elevations, the up and downs of the city. And what can you see from this map? The black boundary is the boundary of Bangalore. And today, what we call BBMP, the boundary of the official boundary of Bangalore. Okay, but you see, what you could say here is that Bangalore is not a flat terrain. You might go through roads now and think of the city as flat, but I'm an old Bangalorean now. And I can remember when I was in school, the city was much more hilly. Now when you see the city, I think we have blasted a lot of the areas and changed the topography, but this is how the city used to look. And you can see that it's much flatter to the right side of the east and much more hilly to the west. Right? So when people came in early, what the early settlers, and how do I know when I said people came in early? So the Ganga dynasty, everybody who came in, villages who came in during different dynasties left inscription stones or inscriptions on copper plates. And that tells us when they actually entered these cities. So what you can see here is when they started coming in, people settled down in the east part of the city. in the comfortable areas. They were not too hilly, not too rocky. They were grassy areas where they could have agriculture. The western areas were far more rocky. But even in the east, during the Chola dynasty, then during the Hoysala dynasty, then during the Vijayanagara dynasty, they actually improved the quality of nature. Right? So what do I mean by improve the quality of nature? Let's go back to one of these maps. So Bangalore is on a plateau, and I'm sure all of you remember your geography lessons about plateaus. Plateaus are often dry, semi-arid landscapes, and Bangalore is no exception. There's the Western Ghats, which is on the western coast. What happens? The clouds that bring rain come and hit the Western Ghats. And Bangalore is on the leeward side of the Western Ghats. That is, it doesn't get too much rainfall because the Western Ghats areas and that coast takes much of the rainfall. By the time the clouds blow into the Bangalore area, we do get monsoon, but not a lot. And what we get is in a very relatively short period, right? And because of this, Bangalore is interesting because you have if you look at Delhi, it was built around the Yamuna River, it's perennial source of water. If you look at Kolkata, it was built around the East Kolkata wetlands, again, okay, which was constructed later, but again, you see port and a lot of water. If you look at Mumbai, similarly, there's a port and there's a lot of water. If you look at any ancient city, typically you'll find an ancient city is built around waterways. Bangalore is an ancient city. You have some historical records that show, for instance, stone megaliths and other kinds of implements that tell us that at least 4,000, 3,000 years ago, Bangalore was populated. When people have been here in the city for a very long time, but there are no perennial source of water. There are no large rivers. There's no coastal area. So how do people live through the year when water is only available? It's only seasonal streams. What they did was they constructed sandras. You can see some of these. For instance, if you look at 15 and 16 in this map, Ganga Sandra, Jakka Sandra. Sandra is a corruption of the Sanskrit word samudra, which means large body of water. So they came to these areas, they scooped out some mud and they created these water bodies in low-lying areas which would actually hold water. And as they came, they steadily created more and more and more of these sandras or samudras, which we call lakes today, along a topographic gradient. What does that mean? That means as you get water higher up, that water fills up during the rains, and then it overflows to the lake below, and then to the lake below, and the lake below. So that not a drop of water is wasted. All of it is stored. Remember, I was telling you that Mumbai or Chennai have floods in some parts of the year and droughts in some parts of the year. That's because the water flows out. Here they hold the water, they held the water through these tanks or other places, sources. And they prize the water very much. Even in any plant, this is a standard inscription. Look at the description of the village. They're describing the village of Sattai Devanapalli. It doesn't matter which village it is. In 1306 CE, trying to talk about a description of a lake. How do they describe of a village? How do they describe the village? It's got a tank and all the wet and dry lands. What they mean by wet and dry lands is the rice is the wetlands and the dry lands are the ragi cultivation. But they say that the village includes the wells underground and the trees overground. Okay, stop to think of that a minute. I don't know if you've seen any land survey documents in your geography textbooks or your geography maps, Survey of India maps. You will see in those maps that they actually show sometimes trees and they have other symbols for wells. But if you look at any city planning document today, you will not see the trees marked. You will not see the wells marked. In fact, we did a study that showed that in the heart of the old city, the cantonment Bangalore, the British parts of Bangalore, there were about 100 years ago, there were 1,500 wells, open wells that service the city. Today, we could find about 50. And of those 50, not even, maybe 2 or 3 were in working condition. Now there's a group that is working to try and revive some of these old wells. But imagine we had 1,500 wells in just the heart of the city, not even the entire city. And these were public wells that served people, that gave them water. But now we've destroyed all of them. So in the olden days, when they surveyed a place, they said this includes the life-giving water underground, which is provided by the wells, and the life-giving shade overground, because Bangalore is also a very hot place. When he said semi-dry, that means there weren't too many trees. It was a thorny and open landscape. The hills had jungles, wild beasts. Very interesting. If you start reading these inscriptions, they're online. So all of you can actually go and read these inscriptions and find out what the ecology of Bangalore used to look like. There are people who were killed by wild boars who were on hunt. There were people killed by tiger attacks. They had cattle raids. They had huge fights with each other over cattle raids. And some of these inscriptions are there. For instance, the Bangalore Museum, there's a beautiful inscription or a hero stone of some two groups which fought during a cattle raid, and the victor, the person who won, also died in the battle and went to heaven. So there's a whole description which shows you how that place looks. Okay. But so the east is got much more water. These lakes were constructed. The west area was much more jungle, wild, with a lot of wild animals. We've forgotten all of this today. Today, when we think of the city, do we think of its climate? We say Bangalore has a good climate because it's cool, but we've forgotten that the city varies. We've forgotten that there's an eastern part, there's a western part. We've forgotten that people built these lakes for the survival of the city. We've forgotten that people planted trees for the survival of the city. All we're doing right now is filling in the wells, filling in the lakes, cutting down the trees, and therefore we are inviting worse climate change on us. Right? So Bangalore grew over years. What did it grow as? How was the old Bangalore? There is a poem called the Shiva Bharat in the 1670s, which tells us how Bangalore used to be around the 1640s, and it's describing Shahaji, Shivaji's father. All of you know of Shivaji, the famous warrior, Maratha warrior. His father ruled over Bangalore for some time, the 1640s to the 1660s. And his court poet Shivanand wrote this poem in 1670 talking about Shahaji's rule in Bangalore. And how does he describe Bingrul, as the Marathas called it? He says it had countless pigeons, peafowl, the city deemed with deep lakes, each house had a well. There were fountains at every square that gurgled and spouted a fine mist. There were trees thick with flowers and shade in every home garden. The city itself was girdled by a bottomless moat, glimmering with water. It was dotted with countless lakes, each as big as a sea. And there were picturesque parks festooned with creepers, swinging daily in the breeze. So this is such a beautiful picture of a city of nature. When the British came in 1791 and they took over the city for some time from Tipu, this is the map they drew of Bangalore. And you'll see that there were lakes, but there weren't too many trees at this area. It's still semi-arid. The city itself has some trees, but largely in clumps. Why are they clumps? Because they're orchards. So normally this would be a guava orchard, a coconut orchard, a mango orchard, a jackfruit orchard, or you find some trees in lines, that is along the roadside, or you find trees around the Pete, which is the old part of the city, and those are thorny trees for fortifications. All trees we use, either fruiting trees that you can grow for some production, or trees along the road for shade, or trees for thorny trees to protect the Pete from invaders. Right? This is a better way of showing you this than maps. It's a painting of Bangalore. See how open it was. You can see the spiky trees to the far left. That's, anyone guesses what that, want to guess what that is? That's Lalbagh. So that's the spiky cypress grove that Tipu and Hyder Ali before him created. It was a park, a botanical garden. Otherwise, there were these open trees and the landscape was very open. They had lakes, but otherwise it was open and barren. But by 1888, since the British had come in and they couldn't, as foreigners with white skin, they couldn't bear the hot city. And so they planted trees to cool the city. And so that's the earliest air conditioning, if you think of it. We're now thinking of air conditioning because of climate change. And what does that air conditioning do? It pumps in more heat into the air. And when you pump in much more heat into the air, what it does is the people who can't afford air conditioning, we're making it hotter for them while we cool ourselves down. And what did they do in those days? They planted trees, which is your natural air conditioning. We have done some research. Actually, you should try some of these. You get these very nice infrared thermometers, which can tell you the temperature of a surface. Just like, you have the infrared thermometers you now use in COVID times. Check your wrist for temperature. You have different infrared thermometers, which will tell you the temperature of a road surface. And if you check it under the tree, the road surface will not be more than 35 degrees. But if you check the same surface which doesn't have a tree, that is just next to this tree, you'll see that the temperature can be 65 degrees, can be 70 degrees. Okay, so urban heat islands can really be reduced if we just plant trees. Very simple thing. And these, our ancestors knew them. They planted trees all across the city. This is how the city looked, for instance, with coconut trees, with other kinds of neem trees. And this is how the Cubbon Park area looked, with very other kinds of large trees. And by 2015, as new parts of the city were created, people kept planting trees, people kept maintaining trees. My friend's grandmother, Honnama Govindaya, was a lady who just passed away recently. She was 98 when she passed away. And when she was in her 70s, she had a fight to save a garden near her house. And she went all the way to the Supreme Court to save this garden and plant trees. And she described to me how in Jayanagar, the area where she moved to, when the area was constructed, she and her children and the children of neighbors would take a bucket and a mug every summer to water the trees. And they are the ones who are responsible for raising these trees from tiny saplings into large towering rain trees that you now see, which can shade half an acre in size. And so people maintain these trees. It's not just that the government planted them. People also maintained them, and you had a city full of trees. Now, in the past 10 years or so, I think Bangalore must have cut lakhs and lakhs of trees for roads, for underpasses, for flyovers, for all kinds of other infrastructural development. There are now estimates that say around 80,000 trees will be cut for a peripheral road around the city. All this thought, all this awareness of air conditioning gone, all this awareness of climate change gone, all this awareness of biodiversity gone. Even the lakes have disappeared. There's only one lake in the heart of the city, which is Alsur Lake. That is also half the size it used to be. But there are signs of hope, and that is because of people like you and me. If you look at the entire Sarjapur area, if you look at the area near the airport, if you look at some of the areas near JP Nagar, groups of citizens have got together and restored lakes. So this is the Kaikondali Lake in South Bangalore. You will see that people have got together and protected this lake and rejuvenated it. Now there are over 150 species of birds that are found in this lake. It was about 10 years ago dry and deserted and completely encroached, and people were starting to take it over for construction. But because people got together and revived it, you now have these, you have biodiversity hubs in the heart of the city and a place that actually cools the city. Slums, it's not just these lakes. Slums are a refuge for biodiversity. We found in a study that slums have the highest proportion of native species or local species. People in slums are extraordinarily knowledgeable about biodiversity. They know how to use local species for everything from medicinal healing to immunity improvement. And in the most difficult of conditions, they manage to grow trees. Look at this place. It's so inviting, so nice and cool and comfortable. Despite the fact that many of them are living in sheet roofs, they managed to keep this place comfortable because they understand the value of trees for air conditioning. These lakes that are restored are used by so many people, and we call that place making. People who are migrants from outside the city start feeling this is their lake. So we've interviewed, for instance, a mother of a differently able child. Her child goes to a regular school and he has too much energy for the school. So that leaves him getting frustrated because every day he is told not to do something and he comes home in a bad temper. So she says every morning she takes him to Saulkere, which is a lake close to where I live. And she just lets him run around the place for about 30-40 minutes. He gets out his energy. He feels calmer and he feels happy because he's near a lake. And how can you not feel happy near a lake? And she says, he has a good day, I have a good day, and everything is, well. So she's very happy with that lake. Right? There are corporate employees who go to an IT company the whole day and they come with their flask of tea to sit at the lake and just to calm down before they have to enter the IT cave again. There are transgender people who say we like being at the lake because the lake accepts us. If we stop and talk anywhere else, the police chase us along because they think we are up to no good. But if we sit in front of this lake, the lake doesn't judge us. So this gives us a sense of why these are, it's not just that they're important for other kinds of things, but they're important for just living well, just breathing, just feeling, like you are alive in a stressful city. And so you need to think of how can we rewild our cities? Like I was telling you, we don't often think of cities as places of nature. But, the Rohit Rao was a wonderful student who worked with us and has done these lovely sketches of the city. These are areas near Baswangudi where we're thinking of rewilding the city, where we're talking about women who do foraging of herbs. These kinds of herbs, so I want to now move towards away from problems to solutions. What have people done? So like they've restored the lakes, there are other groups. There is an artist called Suresh who works who's created an organization called Sarjapura Curries at the end of the city in Sarjapur areas. What do? They take these wild weeds that women forage for and these traditional plants that are disappearing, and they grow these plants. Anyone can go to Suresh or to Sarjapura Curries, get these plants free of charge, get the seeds free of charge. The only rule is that the first time you grow these seeds, the seeds, you have to give them back the seeds so that they can continue to propagate it. The second crop is yours. The first crop goes back to them. Such a beautiful idea. During the pandemic, when many of the village women who are working in houses for domestic for domestic wages, they couldn't because of the lockdown, so they lost their jobs. So he set up this very interesting idea where they were foraging for wild weeds, and you could set up a subscription package where once a week they would send you a package of wild weeds and they will tell you how to use them. So you improve your nutrition, the women get some money, and you can rewild that city because that pays for them to again restore these lakes as natural habitats. Right? There are rewilding food festivals. There's actually one that goes once a year, which is held by the people in Maharashtra, and they do a great job of telling you about wild medicinal greens. These are all in cities. So I'll end with this. We need to think of our cities very differently as ecologically smart cities. We have a large smart city program that focuses only on technology, but we need to think of biodiversity if we have to live well. We need to think of climate if we have to live well. This is again an artwork by Rohit. And it would be very nice to see how all of you imagine the city actually. Can you think of any of the experiences you've had in a city as an ecological place and send us these images? If you can, I'd love to see these images and put them together as collages, and we can use them in talks. You can use them. We can all use them. And yeah, these are some of the books that I have. But I want to end with one last thing. I don't know how many of you knew, you probably have, but the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has its latest report that was launched just a few days ago. And the report talks about the impacts of climate change on the world. Here's a new infographic that they put out for India. What does it tell us? That there will be heat waves, which will impact the cities, and I spoke about them already. There will be coastal flooding. So we need to protect our wetlands, because if we protect our wetlands and our lakes and our coastal fronts, then we are not going to get as much flooding as we have. We are going to have other kinds of impacts. For instance, biodiversity. Forests are going to become vulnerable. Our rice production will decrease. Our wheat production will decrease. So if we forage more for wild weeds, if we can grow more of our own food, we're going to become more resilient to climate change. These are the things we need to start doing in our cities. Now, how do we do this? I think that's really important if we start thinking about this. And what I feel, I'll just stop sharing now, is that one of the best things that we can actually do to combat this is something that people of your age have shown us very well. Climate change is something that now is a household word. Even 5 years ago, when you spoke of climate change, very few people knew about it. Why is the change? So part of it is that we're seeing the effects of climate change, but a large part of it is because of the Fridays for Future and similar kinds of youth movements. Because children who were in school went on school strikes, Greta Thunberg very famously, but also many other school activists, children who are activists across the world. They agitated for climate change. They got groups of people together. They did school strikes. I think people your ages have a way of influencing us with your moral stance. We've all, I don't know if you've seen this, as you grow, people keep telling you that real life is hard, that you need to adjust, that you can't be very idealistic. And the problem is, at some point as we grow, we lose our connection to our ideals, to our spirit of living right. We forget what it is to live morally right. And climate change, biodiversity in our cities, the fact that we have one planet is at the core a moral issue. So we need to do what is right, not just because it's practical, because it gives us more money, because it's useful to live in a way that takes care of climate change. All of that, yes, but it's a moral issue. And I think the children's movement of Fridays for Future brought back the fact that it was a moral issue, and that has really helped make climate change a household word. Yeah, so that I think is to me really powerful. Of course, we need to start thinking of how each of us live. Can we reduce our own climate footprints? That's very important. But in addition, the real power that we have is to challenge companies to do changes. For instance, plastic, we're pouring so much plastic into the world. If each of us stop using plastic, that doesn't mean the world is going to produce less plastic. But if each of us stop, you've heard the old statement that it's not just one, you can break one stick, but you can't break a bundle of sticks. So the power of the collective is really strong. And when we come together as groups, then we can combat these kinds of changes. I read this very interesting thing about 3 years ago. There was a small panchayat in Kerala where a group of college students came together, and for a month they collected every single plastic piece that they got, whether it's chips packets or biscuit packets or a soft drink or whatever it was. At the end, they had these large bundles and they sorted them according to company, and they found that most of it came from 3 or 4 companies. They put them all together in boxes and mailed them with letters to the directors of those companies saying, we really like your products. We wish we could continue buying them, but we wish you would stop using so much plastic. Now here, take your plastic and you recycle it because you produced it. Right? So these kinds of efforts, because it was covered widely in the press, and a group of college students doing this has a very powerful impact. These are the kinds of initiatives that make people change their minds. So I think the power of the collective, if I look at the lake restoration in Bangalore, it didn't happen because there was one influential person or one visionary. It happened because there was an entire group that was committed to it, and the group drew energy from each other. Right? So I think that to me is coming back to my first question, am I an optimist? Yes, I am an optimist. Why am I an optimist? Because I've seen the power of the collective, and that keeps inspiring me. Right? So with that, I'll stop, and I'd be very happy to take any questions if there is time.
Thank you so much, Akka. We do have a few questions, so I'll just read it out for you. Will the remedies to climate change drive people into poverty with higher cost?
It's a very important question. Maybe and maybe not. It depends. Unfortunately, many of the remedies that are being proposed for climate change are remedies that people want to use to gain money. And I'll give you a good example. If you think of the fact that India, for instance, is committed to afforestation, to planting many trees, because trees sequester carbon. And one of the things that India is committed to is planting trees to reduce our carbon, to sequester carbon and to combat climate change. Now, there's 2 ways we can do this. One way is to turn over the goal of planting trees to communities, rural communities, forest communities, community forest groups, and say you plant your own trees. So they will probably plant fruiting trees on the edges of their land, and they will move out of poverty that way. Or you can give it to large companies and say, we are giving you contracts to plant trees, which is the direction that we seem to be going in. What happens if those large companies come in? They will take over these lands of these communities and drive them further into poverty. So yes, in that sense, you will get climate change will be addressed, but driving it further into poverty. So it's always the path we take. We can always choose one path or another, and we need to choose the path that looks at justice as well as climate change, not a path that looks at climate change and money.
The next question is, how do we formally study about climate change? Do we have studies and labs in Bangalore to do so?
There are a lot of labs. There are groups that work on climate change in Bangalore specifically. So the Azim Premji University, where I am, we have a climate center that works on climate change. We will also this year launch a climate exhibition center, or a climate sort of like an interactive museum where school students and college students could come and learn more about climate change aspects. The Indian Institute of Science has a large water lab and does a lot of studies on climate change. So they also have an open house once a year. The Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, or ATREE, has a lab. National Center for Biological Sciences works on climate change. Bangalore University works on climate change. And then there are a number of colleges across the city that also work on aspects of climate change. For instance, Srishti Arts and Sciences does exhibitions on climate change from the perspective of art. So there's a number of different groups and institutions, and there's always going to be something close to you depending on where you are that works at climate change.
All right, so the next question is, are there any campaigns that we can take part in to help create an awareness on climate change?
The best thing would be to launch your own campaigns. There are always campaigns that go on, but the best thing would be really always the most effective to take up a local issue. So what's most local for you? Is it trees being cut? Is it a lake? Is it air pollution? Is it water pollution? Is it plastic? Whatever it is, pick that up and then you can move ahead. I think I'm cutting into lunch.
Last question.
Yeah.
What are the challenges that will arise when taking action to restore lakes and rewild the city, as they have already been encroached on and used for urban development?
I think we have to think creatively. We can rewild rooftops, we can rewild walls, we can find other ways to, so yes, large areas have been encroached on, but there are always things that, if you go to parts of Kerala, you'll see people growing papaya trees and other kinds of trees on the top of the roof, or in Lakshadweep and other places. So we should think more differently about the way we want to address this.
All right, so that's it for the questions. Thank you so much for that beautiful talk, Akka. It was a very informative session. And here we have another beautiful picture drawn by the kids of Parikrama as a token of gratitude.